Steps Ahead actually had its inception gradually at our club, but we toured regularly in Japan as Brecker Brothers or New York All Stars with a lot of the same guys,
Hmm.
Maneri and Steve Gadd. And I think one of Steps's before even Steps Ahead first tours was in Japan. So Japan had a lot to do with the success of that band. And in fact, my brother's last gig before he got the first symptoms of his illness was at the Mount Fuji Jazz Festival. So that was really the last gig he played before he was
Hmm.
taken ill, and then he was better for a little while. But that was his last gig before dealing with the illness.
That's heavy, man. I remember meeting your brother Mike somewhere on the road, maybe with Count Basie or something. I honestly don't
Yeah,
remember at
yeah,
this point. And I met you, I think, with Paquito, but I don't remember that either. And
yeah. It all runs together, man.
but I was going to say about your brother, man. I know I've told you in person that he was so kind to me, and I didn't know him very well. We just called and chatted on the phone, and he really touched my heart, and he taught me a lot of things in those simple phone calls.
Oh, well, that's great to hear and to know. That was Mike. He was as down to earth as you can be. Yeah, it's true. And we miss Mike, but I sure miss Nathan too. He hosted me many times at the jazz seminar week, and I was very fond of him too. In fact, when Mike passed, he was one of the first calls that came through. I
Hmm.
remember that. So
This would be a good place to start, and I'm just going to jump in, man.
okay,
It
you
was
got
it
it.
was the late '70s and the early '80s, and I had delved into massive marijuana smoking and then cocaine snorting and then amphetamine snorting, which really was detrimental in a few years, of course, and it took some years to come out of that. I don't
Yeah,
know if you're comfortable talking about the drug use that's discussed in your brother's book and what I actually already knew about, but
yeah.
it's actually part of the jazz history, man. So
Yeah, it sure is. And I mean, the music was influenced by the various drugs. Yeah, I mean, certainly uh, it would have progressed anyway, and it was hurtful in so many more important ways. But it was part of the scene back then, and I guess playing behind the beat and just feeling really nice when you played. What can I say? But oh shit, it's probably been about 30 years, I think, since I did my last snort, so to speak. And I feel a lot better for it. It was fun while it lasted in a way.
yeah, but I know I couldn't
But
afford to do as much as you guys did,
yeah,
but
in the
I did
long
as much
run.
as I did as much as I could buy.
Yeah, well, we were working a lot and we just figured it was part of the lifestyle. So you just wrote that part off. I hate to think about that, how much more money I would have had at the time.
Yeah, man.
But
What can I
and
say?
in a way, I was lucky that I could always kind of put stops on it. That's the thing,
Mhm.
and a lot of guys couldn't and had to. So I weaned myself off my personal stories. I just slowly weaned myself off everything, and feel a lot better mentally and physically as a result. I'll tell you but look back on it, and there were a lot of stories to tell.
Um, I I remember hearing the stories about your jazz club.
Yeah. Well, that was a true den of iniquity. We talked about it in the book a lot. We had it for 10 years, and it was kind of an accident to start with, the way it all transpired. Uh, but we were lucky to have Kate Greenfield, who was completely inexperienced. She was a school teacher as a partner. We had a friend whose name was Bob Cooper, a very sweet guy, who
Mhm.
ran Boomers. I'll tell you just the whole thing quickly. And I think Bob is still with us. And Boomers sadly closed. That was a big hangout. I played there quite a bit with Hal Galper. Mike played, Freddie Hubbard. All the cats played there. Uh, uh, Nice sized club. But Bob was always very nice to us, let us in, especially when we started playing there and drawing people. So eventually they closed, and Mike got a call from Cooper a few months later that he had found another space and he needed a small loan. And Mike called me, and we gave him some money. Not, it wasn't a whole bunch. Kate was the main investor. He had met her, and we went down to the liquor authority to get the liquor license. And Cooper had too many outstanding uh, parking tickets, if you can believe it or not. Something to the tune of, I might have this figure wrong, like 700 unpaid parking tickets. So he couldn't go on the liquor license, and he was the only one who should have been on it. It was his idea, it was going to be his club. And he got kind of PO'd at the fact that he couldn't be on the license. And we, which we probably shouldn't have done in retrospect, put our names on the license so
Oh,
somebody could be on there. And
right.
eventually he felt really uncomfortable with the whole thing. So he basically split and left us hanging with the club. And Kate, very hard worker, really learned the business. I mean, the club had opened. He was around for a couple months to get us started. And that's how it happened. And she was a hard worker, worked 10, 12, 15 hours a day to keep it running. But we were flying by the seat of our pants for that whole 10-year period, although it became quite a big hangout because partially because we featured all styles of music. It wasn't expressly a jazz club. It was kind of akin to McKell's Uptown. Pat McKell and her husband had the same idea where they might have Art Blakey one night and
Right.
then the young Marcus Miller or cats in the fusion scene the next night. So we had a pretty wide berth of styles of music. I remember having Youssef a lot and Dr. John, but another night Marcus Miller's quartet or Brecker Brothers Fusion. We had an all-star band. That's how, like I mentioned earlier, Steps Ahead eventually got formed with Mike Maneri and Steve Gadd. They played a lot, and they kind of formed a kinship that became a band.
Hmm.
Uh, I
Randy,
played quite
Randy, what year are you referring to, please, for other people?
well. This is 19. Let me think. 1977 through 1987.
Okay.
And we eventually just lost the lease, the commercial lease.
Hmm.
But we were talking earlier about the drug scene. Eventually, Mike and Kate and all of us, they went into rehab, and successfully, I might add. And eventually, the last couple of years that the club was in existence, it became an AA hangout. And meanwhile, we're still trying to sell booze and everyone's drinking water. So it kind of went the other extreme. Maybe not the last 2 years, but the last couple of years, it turned around completely. And Mike had a lot to do with that. Not only, was he a great saxophonist and person, but he lent his he lent credence to the fact that maybe doing drugs isn't such a great idea and you should clean up your act. And he brought many folks into the drug program.
Yeah, I remember. I've been friends with Bob Minster for some years. He's been a great inspiration and help. It was actually Bob Minster I called. I was sitting at home in Yonkers in my apartment practicing, and somewhere I heard that your brother had passed. I don't know. Someone sent me a message, and I called
Ah,
Bob Minster right away. He actually called me right back, and he was downtown Manhattan. He said he was so sad. He said, "Marsh, I've lost my dear friend. Yeah, Mike's gone."
yeah,
And that was
and
heavy. Also, Bob had told me about that he was there at the Jaco Pastorius concert, playing with the Jaco, and he said the day after Mike was supposed to go into rehab. He told me that.
that's right. That's right. It's the truth. They did if I'm not wrong, the birthday concert in
Right.
1982, and my mother went with Mike to help him get into where he had to go. And yeah, that was the last gig before Mike transformed his life, and that's
Did,
a hell of a gig. He said they all sound great on that record. Boy,
did you know that? Did you know that cats were giving him, like a smack and cocaine in little bags? Because did you know about that?
no, no, oh, to go in, okay,
But
just
Bobby
to,
Minter told me, he said the craziest thing was that everyone knew he was going in, so they had these little bags and they were giving, "Hey, you're gonna need this once you get in there, man." It was just crazy, man. So.
well, it was crazy times, but just he really took to it. He had really kind of, in a way, hit rock bottom, as a lot of cats did. I was lucky in the fact. I mean, quite honestly, I was scared of needles. I never got that far into it, and that was really the deal breaker. I think with a lot of guys, a lot of saxophone players, tenor sax. It was
Yeah.
just part of the guys looking up to their heroes, and a lot of their heroes obviously would have been better off and had a lot longer lives if it's just the way it was.
I've been talking to Bob Mover lately because I met
Mm,
Bob a couple years ago. And when we did this
yeah,
short interview, I didn't know that he and Mike were. I knew he knew Mike well, but I didn't know how
yeah.
close they were. Did you know that it was Bob Mover who first did heroin with Mike?
Oh no, I didn't. Well, it's a good, interesting distinction, and we talk every now and then. He's a fabulous player.
Yeah.
That's another one of the real thing right there.
But he also was talking about how when he had gone to Europe and Bob had gone to Europe right after
Yeah.
they first had tried this, and they made this promise to themselves that, look, if we ever get hooked to this stuff, I need you to kick me in my ass, all right? So they both said, okay, all right, we're brothers. And then he went off with Chet Baker and stuff, and he was doing his own
Oh,
thing and getting messed up with his own different drugs over in Europe, he told me. So he came back to New York and he ran into Mike, and the first thing he noticed that Mike didn't look so good, you know what I'm saying? And he said, what's
yeah,
up,
yeah.
man? So long story short, Mike said to him, look, man, he showed him the tracks. He said, I'm going to bend over and I need you to kick me in my ass now.
Oh.
So, we can laugh
Too
about
late.
it. We can we can laugh about it now, but but Bob said it wasn't the greatest of times at that time.
No, no, it catches up with you, and there's no escape. That's what you learn.
So everybody, we're here with Randy Brecker, as you already know, obviously. And
Hopefully, still me.
we'd already jumped into we jumped into the topic of the book I ordered here in Japan right away because I'm a giant Michael Brecker fan, and I've only been able to cop some of his solos and some of his playing, but I just love it. So you had a lot to you wrote the preface. How do I say
Yeah, I
that?
read the preface, and and
Preface.
and, and Bill was very kind. Of course, I wanted to offer my services. I couldn't have been much closer to the subject than I was, and I spent many hours with Bill. He was very organized, and boy, he spent several years working on this book. So I have to really tip my hat to him. He really put so much time, energy, and moreover, love into this book, and it's evident on every page. I just keep it around my desk, and I've read it, but I always pick it up, and there's so much info in there. It's like you're reading it for the first time, So it's really a fun thing to have. That's probably the wrong word since we miss Mike, but he really did Mike justice, and there's a lot of great information. And Mike, in a way, didn't have the most, other than the drug stuff, the most, how would I put it, flamboyant lifestyle, or he wasn't a kind of wild and crazy guy. He was very reserved in his. A lot like Coltrane. It wasn't that dramatic of a life with a lot of crazy stories. He was a pretty introverted guy. As Mike said about Coltrane, he was a guy who took out the garbage. I mean, he was just a working musician. That's how he always felt it. Who practiced for hours and hours in his basement, and was a scientist. I guess I've told this story how he was interested in chemistry and science before the saxophone, and he was always in the basement with his chemistry set,
Hmm.
and that was replaced by saxophone when he first really got into first Cannonball and then, of course, Coltrane. So he was quite an inspiration for me, even though I was the older brother.
I understand. Yeah, I wanted to also talk about your playing. Ever since I first heard your recordings, your playing has been quite mature. Your time has been excellent. Your ideas were developed. Um, I will be a pure musician here and say that your playing was more advanced than your brother's on the first record with Score.
Yeah,
Mike was still in development at the time, and on the Gene Perla archives, which I listened to, where there's a lot of stuff. David Lehman and Grossman by far were ahead of the pack, the two of them, and they were a
yeah.
little older. And Mike was practicing a lot, I understand. But I'm curious of how I've read about your father, I read about your family, but
Mhm.
I've never heard you sound, what's the word I'm looking for? I've never heard you sound not mature since I first heard you play.
Well,
And it's extraordinary to me. I'm curious how you came up, what did you listen to, who taught you trumpet, what did you practice, and how did you get this excellent concept of time? Because no matter what notes people play, time and rhythm is really the like Freddie Hubbard. Freddie
yeah,
Hubbard.
sure. What can you say? Yeah.
So go ahead, man. How did
Well,
you?
I think, and it's probably a common denominator. The fact that my father was a musician, loved music, and an extensive record collection. He loved trumpet players, and I've said this many times, particularly Clifford Brown. We were in Philadelphia. Clifford Brown was from Wilmington, and really, when he had the group with Max Roach, although I was too young to go,
Hmm.
he was the talk of the town. That was their home base. He had moved to Philly. They were playing there all the time. Jazz, Dad and his musician friends would go hear him all the time. I remember he pulled me by the arm. He was listening to Clifford play Ghost of a Chance, and he grabbed me. He said, "Randy, trumpet's the greatest jazz instrument." And this is when I was like 7 or 8 years old. I hadn't even started playing yet. Also, when they had jam sessions at the house, was a very young, great trumpet player, Bobby Mojica, who had a career in Detroit. Wonderful, uh, I would say, Chet Baker inspired. I was surprised when I heard him play years later that we had a lot of common things. So I think a lot of his playing rubbed off on me as a youngster before I
Hmm.
even started to play. I started at age 8, and in our school they only had trumpets or clarinets. It was a suburban. We were sadly one block out of the city limits. Philadelphia had a pretty good school system as far as music was concerned, but in Cheltenham Township and my grade school, it wasn't developed. It was once a week. They had trumpets or clarinets, so I grabbed a trumpet because I, I had my sights set on a trombone because as an 8-year-old, it looked like a little more fun with the slide.
Right.
But I got a teacher pretty early on named Sigmund Herring, who is very well known, has many books out. Was in the Philadelphia Orchestra. I suppose I started with him. I guess it's hard to remember, but I must have been 8 or 9. He was my first teacher. But I also had, and here was the clincher. I was probably about 9 or 10, and I had the dad had given me my own record player in my room, and this was before all the play along records. But I had the brilliant idea of stealing his records, taking them up to my room, and playing with the records.
Hmm.
Probably at 9 or 10,
Wow.
and I was still pretty well versed uh, in jazz by that time because
All
that's
right.
all we did at home. I was a big fan of. I always bring this up too. Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross.
Oh yeah.
Dad was a fan, and I could sing all the solos, all the John Hendricks stuff. I loved that. To me, it was so entertaining and just so hip.
And that
As an 8-year-old, I was in
that
third
that
grade.
that's very key. Singing is key to learning this music, I think.
Yeah, and that would really was if there's no shortcuts, but there is if it it's a good way to put it. It was a nice key, uh, all by accident. I just liked the stuff, so I could
Hmm.
think, "Hey, baby, I'm going to tell you about your loving," and he gives me a hug and a sweet turtle. I'm pretty baby. I won't satisfy turtle. Hey here. You could scat sing with John Hendricks. I had memorized it all before I was
Wow.
even playing trumpet, and I think that has a lot to do with with my time being good. It was internalized early on. And I
Mm.
started with ballads when I started to play with records. I remember that, and this was 1955, 1954. Miles's first record on Columbia around about midnight.
Hmm.
I learned by ear, just I tried to play what Miles was doing, and also Chet
So
Baker, who we talked about
I'm
briefly.
I'm curious. You just did this on your own? No teacher said,
No, no, this part was on my own, but my dad was a big influence. He would also take me downstairs. This was before Mike was playing and taught me tunes. And he was pretty much an ear player too,
Hmm.
but great ears. And he was a good composer, good singer, uh, uh, a lawyer by vocation, but he was really a musician first. He came up in a poor family and he was worried about making a living as a musician, but it was always his first love. So he kind of simplified everything, explained to keep the melody as he put it in the back of your head, keep singing the melody and play around the melody, which is what I started to do when I started to play with the records. And he had really good time. So when he taught me tunes, I remember he taught me Our Love Is Here to Stay, Lullaby of Birdland, uh, tunes like that. And I've just played by ear. This was before I started to transcribe, but I did a lot of that. I practiced my classical studies for Mr. Herring and all his pedagogical books that are still available. They help with my trumpet technique and my sound. But I would count down the minutes. I had a pad of paper. I was supposed to practice for an hour or whatever it was, and I'd say 15 minutes left, 10 minutes left. And then I could put it on the records and just blow. I found
Wow.
extra time to do that. Chet Baker with Jerry Mulligan. I learned My Funny Valentine, and it was also a little later when Mike started to play clarinet 3 years later. He didn't want to play the same instrument as I did. They still only had trumpets or clarinets. He studied with a player from the Philadelphia Orchestra too, very good player named Leon Lester, and that gave Mike. I mean, literally, he played clarinet for 5 or 6 years before he switched to alto, so that gave him a good foundation. Yeah, that's a good. I've been told a great way to get a foundation on woodwinds because the instrument is so difficult.
Yeah.
And he also, played with records and practiced, and we played together in the
Hmm.
bathroom, improvising because we liked the echo, and
Wow.
our bedrooms were joined by a bathroom, and we quickly discovered it felt better to play the horns with a lot of echo and reverb around. So we'd just go in there and play anything, just make stuff up.
What
But
what
I
is
think that
what's your age difference between the two of you?
there was a 3 year age difference. And I mentioned too that my sister, who was in between, about a year and a half in between, was a fine musician too, a classical pianist.
Hmm.
And now, the last 10 or 15 years or so, she plays harp and has a couple books out. But she was always reticent to play in front of people. But she got a master's degree in music composition
Wow.
at Penn, and we had a family band as kids. But both Mike and I kind of doubled, and he was great on drums and vibes. And Emmy was a pretty good bass player, dad on piano. So we rehearsed together, had a little family band. He had jam sessions, people over on weekends to play. I had mentioned Bobby Mojica, but some really good players. And I'll scoot into this. I was probably about 12 at this time, and lo and behold, John Hendricks was actually snowed in at a gig in
Hmm.
Philly. And by then I had heard Lambert Hendricks and Ross. live 2 or 3 times. And a guy named Irv Weiner, who's a guitarist who was over a lot jamming, brought John Hendricks to our house, and he was snowed in for the weekend with his wife Judith. And by then, Dad had a tape recorder. He'd gotten his first tape recorder, and they were playing a tune, and Dad had me go get my trumpet, and I sat in with the band. And John Hendricks, I can't quite remember the tune. It was a ballad, and I remember John singing it, and it was the first time that I actually heard myself play from a recording. And I have to admit, I sounded pretty good. I had good time already, and the conception was already there. I didn't know anything about harmony, but you could tell that I had been working on it. And I kind of got a round of applause from John Hendricks and the rest of the musicians. And 50 years later, I went to see John. I had been friendly with him throughout the years, but I hadn't really been in a room with him. He was opening at the Blue Note with Moody. Great show. And I happened to be with John and his wife 50 years later, Judith, and Mike was already ill. So this was within the last 14 or 15 years. John asked about that recording. He had remembered that Dad had recorded. He said, "Do you have that recording? That's history. That's history." And I was just shocked that all those years later, he remembered that there was a recording of that afternoon in Philadelphia. Wow. So really took me aback. And I asked my sister if by any chance she might have the recording, but it's lost to the vicissitudes of time, I guess. But that was a big thrill.
How old were you when you did that?
I was probably no more than 12, believe it or not.
Wow.
I was, 12 years old, something like that. I was.
So this is what's fascinating to me. See, my dad stayed away completely from jazz music. He had everyone knows this who watches my interview, so I keep it really short. He was in World War II. He came back. He got married. Then he got on GI Bill, got into college with my mother's encouragement, already had a master's degree, and then went on and became one of the first black, I think actually the first black oral surgeon in Pittsburgh. And then he taught at the University of Pittsburgh Dental School. But for some reason, something happened in his life. Before he left, I heard he listened to jazz. When he came back, he would only listen to classical music. And so all I heard in the house was classical music. And he took all my mother's jazz records and got rid of them. The first time I heard jazz was with a Louis Armstrong tape in 8th grade. And I really liked him. My mother was really excited, so she started sneaking some clarinet records upstairs, Pete Fountain and stuff like that. But what's interesting to me is I thought I was unique. Then I discovered a lot of black families who had been through this. Somewhere around the time, it seems people got embarrassed about their own history and tried to move up.
Yeah, I can understand it. Sure.
And
that's totally understandable. And conversely, my dad, and this wasn't too bright of him, hated classical music. He just said it all sounds the same, so skip it. And that wasn't the greatest advice, because I enjoy quite a bit listening to classical music and classical trumpet players, and that's a big part of my oral history too. But it's strange, the twist of fate, but you weathered the storm, young man. You sure found your way through there. And Pittsburgh has a great, fabulous history.
Yeah.
So we're both lucky that there's such tradition in both Philadelphia and Pittsburgh.
That's true.
I used to love going there and playing Crawford Grill No. 2 with Horace back in the 60s and 70s.
So tell me about your first recording, which I don't know when I discovered it. I remember I emailed you about it. I wanted to hear how Mike sounded on the first recording. What year was that? Had you already been with Horace Silver? What was your first big gig, Horace?
It was around. It's good that you're asking questions about those years, because they're the only years that I can really remember before it gets all jumbled together. I'll lead up to it. My first, I guess, big recording, I think, was the Blood, Sweat, and Tears record, strangely enough, Child is Father to the Man. and was the last guy to join that band. They already had a trumpet, the horn section worked out, but one of the two trumpet players was also a high school band teacher, and he didn't want to leave town. And I knew the other trumpet player who had gone to Berkeley, gone to Juilliard, and I had made some rehearsals with the Juilliard big band. So I somehow got the call, and I joined Blood, Sweat, and Tears. At the same time, I was playing with Clark Terry's big band. Those were some of the first gigs. Clark Terry's big band, Thad and Mel's big band, jazz orchestra, a lot of big bands, rehearsal bands. I had been on the collegiate, this is a roundabout answer, but I'll get to it, on the collegiate jazz festival circuit with the Indiana University Jazz Ensemble. And we had won the Notre Dame Jazz Festival in 1965. Clark Terry was a judge, gave me a trumpet award, and called me when he found out I had moved to town. And conversely, there was another jazz competition in Vienna in 1966, and Mel Lewis was one of the judges. So when he found out I moved to town, there was an opening in Thad and Mel's band, and invited me to do that. So I was with them during this whole period, didn't do recording. I also joined Duke Pearson's big band, which had a lot of the same personnel as Thad and Mel's band. And I forget how I met Duke, probably just he heard me somewhere playing around. And he was responsible for signing me to Solid State Records, which was Blue Note Records, was the same office. And that's how the session came about. And that was really, with Duke Pearson's big band, that was really my first real live and important, to me anyway, jazz record date. And I was nervous as hell, you know, I played a couple solos on that one, but just being in a real recording studio, I think that was my first time at Rudy Van Gelder's. I was just in shock that I was there, or playing with any of these guys. It happened pretty quickly. Thankfully, when I moved to New York, I did a lot of so-called dumber gigs, playing with soul bands and weddings and all that stuff. But there was a lot going on in New York. This is 1966. There was just a heck of a lot going on. You know, everybody had a rehearsal band. Chuck Israel's, well, I can't think of a lot of bands.
I'd like to interject here something you said, which I've talked with a lot of cats now. There's a lot of young players now coming out of colleges and institutions in the jazz method who have technique beyond what we can even imagine. I mean, the technique that just makes me wonder what's the point after a while. It's more like a sporting event now. But the big key to I talk to a lot of older cats like Oates and myself now, you know, and a lot of my buddies. The big key to learning the music was that all of us played in big bands. Like I got a first start with Lionel Hampton, and then I went to Illinois Jack Kett, and then with Duke Ellington, and then finally subbing in Basie, and then all the local, you know, New York. Remember all the rehearsal bands? I mean,
sure. You probably played in a lot. When you're in a big band,
you learn how to edit yourself. That's the first thing, because maybe you got a chorus or two. You know what I'm saying? The band's playing background. You got to have a conversation with the band. You just can't get up and play everything you know. And then you have to learn how to play in a section. Now, a lot of these young guys get in a section, man, they cannot play in a section. You know, I mean, they stand out. They're not playing with the section. What's your feeling about the lack of big bands, the lack of mentors like Lionel Hampton, Buddy Rich, you know, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, it's just a sad state of affairs. Luckily, they get some of that in, you know, jazz education is in good shape. There's a million schools, and they get a certain amount of that, like I did. I went to Indiana University. The big band was very good, and we actually toured. We ended up going on a State Department tour from winning the Collegiate Notre Dame Jazz Festival. So we were on the road for 16 weeks straight in the Middle East, all the Eastern Arab countries, India, Pakistan, then Ceylon. So I got a little taste, and I think that really helped my playing, of really playing every night with a good trumpet section, the rigors of the road, learned the inside out of pacing. Like you said, you only had one or two, maybe three solos a night where you have to edit your own playing. And maybe the rigors of the road add something to your playing too. It's all, you're living life, and you get to the soul of your instrument by having to get on stage when you've been traveling for 14 hours and something comes out of your horn that doesn't come out if you're just studying in college. We certainly learned that when we hit that tour for 4 months. So I think I wish I wish I could turn back the clock. That's all I could say, because those were really rewarding years playing in all those big bands. They just helped my playing immeasurably.
What was that that Phil Wood said when he went to do one of those jazz clinics at college? He said, "So you want to be a musician?" So he would get a bus. Let's get on the bus. We're going to ride around for 8 hours, and then we're going to get off the bus, and then we're going to play for an hour, and then we're going to get back on the bus. We're going to ride around for another 8 hours.
That's right. That's how you learn the hard way, the reality of it all.
Right.
But I think your analysis is very astute, man. Big band. I remember, it's funny, years and years ago talking to, that's Bill Burry, wonderful trumpet player, whose place I took in Thad and Mel's band. He was the jazz trumpet player on the first couple of records. Great player who had been on the road with all the road bands. And he explained it. There was just it added a certain finesse to your playing from the experiences of playing in big bands. I couldn't have developed like I did without those first years. I didn't actually go on the road a lot with big bands, but I was playing, and every week, there was something going on. We'd go up to Lynn Oliver's on 86th Street, or there was a place on 19th Street. Joe Henderson had a big band. We rehearsed with him, Kenny Durham, Donald Byrd. It was amazing.
Who was in the? Was Thad Jones? Thad Jones passed in 1965, though, so you missed that, right?
No, Thad. No,
75. The 70. What year was it?
no, Thad. I don't know the year, but he left Thad Mel band sometimes in the 70s to move to Copenhagen. He had a gig over there, and Mel was incensed.
That's right.
And I'm not sure the year he died, but it was too young. Sometime in the 80s, mid 80s, I think.
That's right, because he
Sometime.
took over the Basie band. He was the first
Yeah,
band director in 1984. Now I got it. 1984, and he passed away in 1985 when he led the
okay,
band.
yeah, that sounds about right, because he did take over the Basie band, which.
So my question
And
was, when you were in the Mel Lewis band, was Thad Jones there? Or?
yeah, no, this was 1970, 1968, 68. It was almost the original band.
Okay.
I took Bill Burry's place, and I had the seat next to Mel. Snooky was on the other side. And it was all the original cats. And here I am, like 21, 20 years old. I don't know how to put it. I was scared.
Man, that
But it
band
was,
that
what can
band
you
was
say?
popping and swinging and like going to church every night, man.
Yeah, and I would have, had I known the business better, eventually I joined Horace Silver in 1968. And I just didn't know. Horace hired me partially because the previous trumpet player had been trying to float in 2 or 3 groups at once. I can't think of his name right now. So and Horace said when I got the gig that we'd be working 3 weeks a month. And I said, well, I can't, I have to go tell Thad and Mel that I'm leaving the band. I'm going on the road with Horace. And Horace, which I did, and they accepted they wished me well, and I subbed with the band for years after that. But had I known better, Horace never worked 3 weeks a month. I could have been official member of the band for another 10 years had I known the business better, but I, gave my notice. And I played with them, for 30, 40 years after that, subbing in different shares. But that original year I spent in the band was I just had to pinch myself. There's a TV show Ralph Gleason had, and you can see me, I don't play any solos, but This is 1968. You can see the skinny goateed guy on the end next to Mel is me. So I have proof that I was there. I never recorded with them, sadly. But
I've had a lot of things happen like that where it was weird. And somewhere in the mid '90s, I had all sorts of different bands to go to, and ended up picking Frank Foster had put me on lead alto in the Loud Minority band.
oh yeah, that was another
He had
one.
left
Yeah,
Basie, and I did one of the tours, and that I didn't realize that was a big thing, you know, because I was also playing with Poquito's band, and
right.
and so I made a lot of dumb choices, man, like that. Paquito had a gig, and I told Frank said we had rehearsed. I've been in rehearsal playing the chair, and he said we're going to Finland for 2 weeks. You know, these are the dates. So I'm like a big dummy. I call up and say something to his wife that I have a gig with Poquito. Now everyone was subbing out Poquito's band. Everyone was subbing that man out because there wasn't enough
Yeah,
room.
yeah.
Man, Frank got so pissed off at me, man. It lasted for a couple of years. He called me up and
Oh.
said, "Well, I didn't really want you in the band anyway, motherfucker." Frank Foster is, and I was going to get Brad Lilly, but that was gonna, that's it. That's the end of it. Boom. I was like, "Damn."
Oh,
And someone else got the chair I won't mention, and I never worked in the band again,
oh,
man.
that's
And
too
that
bad.
that
But
band lasted like 15 some years or more, man.
yeah, you just never know, man. My classic story, and I wanted to play, so I quit Blood, Sweat, and Tears to join Horace, uh,
You
Horace's band, and they begged me to stay, and they were getting a new lead singer. I had done the first record,
Oh no.
and Al Cooper, who kind of was the band leader, didn't want to share the vocal responsibility, so he left. He left. We had a band meeting, and the rest of the nucleus of the band, we were on salary, the horn players, except for Freddie Lipsius, who had written the chart. And they said, "Look, we're going to cut you in. We're going to share everything now. Everybody's going to be equal partners." And I said, "Well, look, I got called from Horace Silver, and I really want to play because I didn't get to play that much in the band. It was like playing in a big band. And anyway, I don't think you guys will make it without Al." And they had gotten David Clayton Thomas to sing. And next thing you know, their second record, which they begged me, stay, please. I got sold off my best friend the gig. He didn't really even want to do it.
You did.
Yeah, well, the next day I had a rehearsal with Joe Henderson Big Band, and Louis was sitting next to me. And I said, "Look, man, I'm in a spot. This gig, it was at the time $100 a week, whether you work or not, maybe $200 a week." And by the end of the rehearsal, I talked them into doing it for a while. And they went into the studio. Of course, they recorded Spinning Wheel and When I Die and You Make Me So Very Happy. The record sold something like 15 million copies, and their salaries went up like 5,000%. And I was getting $250 with Horace Silver, $250 a week. Louis' salary went up to $5,000 a week in 1968. That was like 20,000 a week. They were number one on the charts. They all bought houses. Louis bought a split level apartment. In fact, we were taking trumpet lessons together in New Jersey, and he'd pick me up in a limo. We were taking a bus originally out to New Jersey, laughing the whole time. And I'm making $250, and Horace took taxes out, which was $140. I remember all this. And then he neglected to say that we had to pay for our hotels.
Yeah,
So
when I
I
first
think
got
you were
the
feeling
man,
bad.
you had to pay $30 a night for the hotel
Yeah.
too.
And then I remember after a long tour with Horace, and Blood, Sweat, and Tears had all this success, blah, blah, blah. I went back to Jim and Andy's, and I was expected to be, I had it all fantasized in my head that people would applaud, all the musicians would hang out there. When I walked in the door, because I left the rock group to play jazz. Instead, I got out of the cab, and I had all this was going to happen in my head. And Grady Tate was outside in the street, and he grabbed me like this, and he held me up against the wall, and he said, "Were you crazy? Were you crazy?"
Oh Oh man.
But you don't know the business. We were young, and had
Right.
I known, I wanted to play too. I don't regret the decision at this point, but at the time, it was kind of rough.
That is rough, man. Especially
Yeah,
when that happened. And look, when I was about to be 10 years old because I was born in 1959, and I remember spinning wheel, man. That was
yeah,
gigantic, man. my,
yeah.
my brother was a little bit older than me. He was 8 years older than me. So when he left to join the Air Force, he's a musician too. He left to join at the Air Force Academy, the
Ah,
Drum and Bugle Corps. He plays trumpet. He played classical trumpet as a kid. He
oh,
left some of
great.
those records behind when he left, right? The Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, all that stuff. And I used to listen to that all the time, man. So
Yeah.
that was one of my
Well,
favorite records, man. I didn't know the
yeah.
whole story about you.
Yeah, well, I played, like I said, on the first record, funny, called Child is Father to the Man, which also
Right.
became, and that helped my career. I had some solos on that record, and I'm still friends with a lot of the guys in the band. In fact, I talked to Bobby Colomby last week, who was the
Hmm.
drummer and still owns the name and still sends a
Oh yeah.
band of young kids out as Blood, Sweat, and
My,
Tears.
my buddy Ken Joffrey and another buddy play saxophone with him.
Ah, yeah. So they're still going, and he's kind of, I guess, still raking in some money. But it was. I learned a lot from that gig too.
Right.
Just that there was a world outside of Jim and Andy's and bebop, and there was a lot of uh, uh, and not only about the business, but how to put those kind of records together. From doing that, Child is Father to Man, how to build a record up from the bottom up and double track the horns and what effects to use and stuff.
Well,
So I learned a lot from
well,
that
let's
experience.
look at the good result. If you hadn't taken the path you had,
Yeah,
maybe the Brecker Brothers band and that whole
yeah,
conception with Clive Davis might not have taken effect though. So
yeah.
what
That's
what what what
exactly true.
what,
It all
what
worked.
year what year was it? I know Bobby Mover told me, but what year was it that slowly? Basically, he told me a story about how Mike and he used to hang out a lot apparently in practice and stuff and go to
Yeah,
some
they
bars
did. I
together.
remember them being together.
And Mike told him my life is about to change. Bob said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, my brother's got this thing going with this band, and we're going to get signed by Clive Davis, and it looks like we're going to make a lot of money." And he actually said, "It's really my brother's thing, man. It's his thing, but they want to make it this Brecker Brothers thing." And he says, "My whole life is about to change,"
Huh.
and then I think they got high after
Maybe so.
that.
Higher.
I think that's what Bob said. Well, we had to celebrate then.
Any excuse. But I mean, that was really the truth. We had Mike and I by then, uh, to bring you up to date. We had started. Let me think. We had played in an R&B band with. Well, we had a group called Dreams, which in the late '60s into 1970, that we were signed by Clive Davis with Billy Cobham on drums, Eddie Vernon, the lead singer, and eventually Don Grolnick was in that band, and Chuck Rainey, and that led to Will Lee in the band. And we had established ourselves kind of through that group because we were a house band at the Village Gate, kind of established kind of our studio career. People would hear us Barry Rogers on trombone. Uh, so, so that kind of established a lot of contractors would come down, and we started getting calls for various records. And that led to eventually on the live scene, Billy Cobham leaving Dreams to join Mahavishnu. They became wildly popular, and Billy became very famous as a name under his own right, doing an album called Spectrum, which did very well. So Billy asked Mike and I to join his band eventually in something like 1973 or so, and he recorded a lot back then. That's why there's so many Cobham records. And at that time, I started thinking about really trying to write my own music because I was so busy in all these things, but I hadn't really done any solo records since the record you talked about, which was in 1960. Never got back to that. So that was 1967 or 68 that Score was recorded live at Rudy Van Gelder's. The whole record took 6 hours. And Mike had flown in or had just arrived in New York, was 19 years old, not really fully developed. I had been playing with Horace Silver and doing all this stuff. So, like you said, I was a little more mature as a player, yet he was still in the developmental stage. And plus, he had started really late. He was really 15 before he really started taking music seriously. He was into his chemistry set. And when he discovered Train, he started practicing really hard. But he was really on that record still in developmental stage where he had a lot of chops, but wasn't sure how to use them yet.
There would seem to be a heavy Wayne Shorter influence there.
Yeah, I think that was there too. He loved Wayne Shorter, and of course Joe Henderson probably were his three biggest influences. But by the time you were speaking of 1973, 74, we had done all the Billy Cobham records. We had played with Edwin Birdsong. We had done a million sessions, Dreams. But he wasn't really yet career oriented. I gave deep thought to writing my own music at this point. I wanted to do a solo record. And my friend Dave Sanborn had moved to, it's funny, all this stuff is connected via other streams. We had gone to band camp together at Indiana University when we were 15. And even then, he had a distinctive conception and sound. You know, he was Dave Sanborn at age 15. You just never quite heard anything like that. And he had moved to New York, and I thought that would be a great horn section, me, Dave, and Mike. And Will Lee and Don Grolnick from Dreams, they were available. I had my ears set on Harvey Mason, who I played with a couple times, jammed with when he went to Berkeley, and various other people in my head. Don Elias, wonderful percussionist, Ralph McDonald, who I played with a lot. So the idea really coalesced, and I furiously wrote 9 arrangements, 9 original tunes, including Skunk Funk and Sponge, all that, over a period of maybe a year, wow, with the intent of doing a Randy Brecker solo record. And lo and behold, we had you would just call it a rehearsal band with the nucleus of those guys. And other guys were writing. Don Grolnick was writing a lot, keyboard. Steve Kahn was around writing a lot. He eventually was on a lot of our records. And we'd get together and just rehearse. And I had this idea of recording this stuff. But somehow, through the grapevine, word had gotten around, I guess, about these rehearsals. And a guy named Steve Brecker called me, who had just started to work again for Clive Davis, who had signed us as Dreams to Columbia Records in the early 70s. And Clive had had a disastrous downfall, and I think it was trumped up charges of payola or some BS that, you know, everyone went on in the business, but they pegged him as the one to really lean on, and he lost his job at Columbia Records, and he was coming back with a vengeance by starting a new record company called Arista, which was an outgrowth of Bell Records. And I got approached by Steve Brecker saying that Clive had heard about the music and wanted to sign the band, or sign me, as he put it at first. But the caveat was Clive wanted to call the band the Brecker Brothers. That goes back to what Mike was saying. And I initially, I said, look, I got to think about it because, you know, this was supposed to be my thing. We've been rehearsing. I've been really planning on this for a couple of years. And Mike is not, or Sanborn, were really career oriented yet. So they were just practicing 10 hours a day. But the opportunity was so unique, I relented and said, okay. I remember saying, call it the Brecker Brothers, but it's going to look funny because Sanborn's in the front line. He's going to look like the long lost cousin or something. Call it that. And the rest is history. You know, they called it the Brecker Brothers. And I've told this story several times, but there's another link to the chain. We went in, recorded all the stuff, And we really knew what we were doing because we had done so many records, going back to the Blood, Sweat, and Tears record where I knew the technique. We knew what to record when. You don't go in like with a band like that and do the whole thing live. We did a lot of it live, but we double tracked the horns, we just knew the technique, how to do that kind of a record. Steve Brecker was amazed, but we were studio guys. We knew how to do it, and it came out great. Clive got the 9 tracks and called me up to his office. And he was really a diplomatic guy. I love that guy. He was like a father figure, just a brilliant, and not a musician. He just had really natural ears and knew how to hear things that would sell to a mass audience but still be good music. Anyway,
let me just add for those people in the audience who don't know, Clive Davis also signed Whitney Houston and a host of.
Quite a few.
There's a lot of young people who don't know anything
right.
about this man.
Well,
he don't know what a record company is.
Yeah. Well, beside Whitney Houston, boy, well, it all goes back. He was the head of the whole music world. That's how you would put it. He was head and shoulders too, right? Above.
Wasn't it Kenny G also?
That's a good question. It might have been. I think Kenny G might have been on Arista. I forget now. But, Whitney was one of his last time. But, at Columbia Records, that in the 60s, that was by far the biggest record company. Simon and Garfunkel, they come to mind. But Sly and the Family Stone, he was responsible. And Clive just knew a good thing when he heard it. And on Arista, for instance, he assigned Barry Manilow, who was just a jingle writer but a good singer. He heard something in Barry Manilow who became amazingly popular, and it would offer little suggestions. Like Barry Manilow had a tune called Mandy, I think. I forget. And Clive said
it was Mandy, but I was in high school.
Oh, okay. Well, originally, I think it was called Brandy, or the vice versa. And Clive said, "No, call it Mandy because it's better."
Get out of here.
He would add little things, and he was always right. Anyway, so I'm up in his office saying, "All these 9 tunes, they're great, but you need a single, just like that." And I went, "A single? Wait a minute. First of all, you're calling it the Brecker Brothers, and I wanted to, it's all my music." He said, "Well, in a nice way, very very diplomatic, if you don't do a single, I'm not releasing it." So, this is the truth. I trudged back to our rehearsal place. A lot of the guys lived in the same building, so we rehearsed in their apartments. And the so-called force was really with us. I explained the situation. I said, "Look, he's not going to put it out unless we come up with we need a single." And we jammed up. We were good at this from all the record dates where you have to kind of think on your toes when the producers don't know what's happening, or when you just show up and what are we going to play? We jammed up a tune.
Let me guess. Was that Sneaking Up Behind You?
That's the tune. Yeah.
I win. What I win?
Yeah. But that, thankfully, everybody had a little piece of that tune. I still somewhere have that cassette where all the pieces fit. Clive came to the recording session. He loved the tune. Thankfully, we're going, oh, thank God. He offered a couple suggestions in the arrangement, which we did. Wanted to alter the hook and change it to some little things that this guy just had ears of elephant ears.
So Randy, I have a music question for you.
Yeah.
Now you said that you said you worked it up, you got this tune together. Can you describe actually? Did you write some stuff down? Did the band just come up with some parts? Did someone get a groove? Tell me the musical process.
Well,
because I hear a lot of that. People in the studio, they work something up, and the next thing you know, you got a hit. I'd like to hear about that.
Well, the only thing I remember, we just were sitting there, and we didn't know what we were going to do. And Grolnick said, "Well, you guys always play this line, or you play a lot of dit stuff," which we did when we had done Dreams, and we were big fans of James Brown and Fred Wesley. You know, I'd done a lot of session work with Fred and Parliament Funkadelic, Bernie
Woo.
Worrell, and that was a big influence. So I do remember the first thing that we came up with was a I can't even do it. I can't. My tongue doesn't work that fast anymore. But from there, somehow we were this nucleus of cats. This is hard to describe, particularly Mike and Sanborn. We were good at jamming things up, so nothing was written down. And let me preface it by saying it was the same thing with the band Dreams. I don't know if you've ever heard those records. We did the two
Yeah.
records for Columbia. And what separated Dreams from Blood, Sweat, and Tears in Chicago was the fact that those tunes, everything was jammed up. We never wrote anything down. We were just good at
Wow.
jamming with the rhythm section. Somebody would think of a part or something, it would just evolve. We would jam, we'd record everything, and we'd listen to the recording the next day and add, either keep what we did, but maybe make a note, but nothing was ever really
Would you,
arranged.
in those days? I'm sorry, that was my heater remote. Would
Yeah,
you
I was
piece? Would you piece things together tape wise?
not really, not too much really. On the recordings, there were always some editing. We were just good at spontaneity, spontaneously jamming up parts. It's hard to put into words.
What about
Uh,
overdubbing solos? Would you overdub solo if you
yeah,
had
we would
ideas?
overdub solos quite a bit. On the original Dreams record, we did. We tried to record as much as possible because we wanted it to be spontaneous. But eventually, on all the records, we ended up 95% of the time uh, recording overdubbing solos, or maybe playing, but then keeping the core of the solo, but
Right.
fixing solos. You could still do that, but then yeah, cutting the tape. It's just this little. It's unbelievable that great engineers could do that with a razor blade. Cut it, put the cut aside, and then tape it back together. That's what we did. Great. So you would literally sometimes piece together a solo, uh,
Hmm.
and we just got good at it. But there's a lot of records. One comes to mind. There's a Ralph McDonald record called "The Path," where Ralph traces his ancestry, his musical ancestry, in a musical piece through growing up in the Caribbean islands and moving northward, slowly making his way to New York, and the music uh, shows all his various influences. And it's like a 20-minute piece. And on the session where me, Mike, Barry Rogers, who was the trombone player in Dreams, and Sanborn, and Ralph asked us go in the back room and jam up some parts to this track, which we did. We were just good at it. Somebody would have an idea. It's hard to explain how we did it, but you, I'm sure, have done some of that where you just somebody has an idea, you keep the idea, somebody finds a harmony part, and then we alter the part a little, and then it just kind of grows out of a little idea. And that's what we did on Sneaking Up Behind You. Will stuck a little section in that he wrote on his own. Uh, uh, that was really the only thing that maybe had some thought behind it,
Right.
which was kind of the bridge. Da, 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 3, 4, da, 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 bow, bow,
Right.
bow. And he stuck that in. That might have come a little later, but the rest of the thing was all just jammed up. Will thought of the snaking up behind you, stuck that in, and and it just came together, man.
So
But we had done that a lot in the past.
did you have some secret sexual innuendos going along with this?
Oh, maybe in the back of our minds, maybe more than that. That was a big part of it back
Big
then
part.
too.
You know,
uh,
it's really interesting to me, and I think would be interesting to young people. See, somewhere around the time when I was after I moved to New York, record companies started to die along with the music industry. You know, I didn't come up to New York to the late '80s and didn't
yeah,
get the
that's
first gig with
exactly
Lionel
when.
Hampton in 1990, and it was,
Yeah,
man, it was plummeting around then. I mean, it was falling off a cliff.
Yeah, it
I remember
was.
I got to work with Jackie Kelso in the Count Basie band. Jackie Kelso was
Yeah,
part of the Wrecking Crew and recorded thousands of records, right?
yeah, yeah.
And I got to meet Carol Kay online, and we chatted quite a bit
Oh,
because I was
oh,
in the
excellent.
Basie band, and she knew Grover Mitchell and Carol and Jackie. She doesn't really talk to a lot of people, and we emailed back and forth, and she was just telling me stories about practice and how things that you talk about, how in the studio how she would come up with something and Plaz would come up with something and then
Yeah,
I forgot the drummer's name, you know, but
yeah. Hal
Lane,
Blaine,
how
Hal Blaine.
and basically describe what you described.
Yeah,
That, you know, there was no music, and most of the time, she said these guys would bring in music that was kind of illegible, or no one really knew what was going on in it, and they would work up a whole thing. And how much she suggested about the Cher song. What's the Cher song? When she came up with the first part of the Cher song, and then the Boot
oh,
song, all this stuff that became legendary, and
yeah,
that's a part of the music that's another part of the music, American music, that's missing nowadays. Without those record companies and those studios where cats sit like you were doing for 8 hours
yeah,
at a time, and I heard Miles Davis created in a similar way when Tio put him in there. They basically just were playing for a long time, you know.
yeah. I mean, he didn't rehearse. You know, I always use this quote. You know, a critic asked Miles, you know, how come you never rehearse? And Miles said, you can't rehearse the future. So that was his answer. It was so intelligent and so true in a way. And all those records were not only beyond first takes, all those great quintet records. And you can kind of hear this if you listen closely, were really rehearsals. As soon as they got the music, Wayne and Herbie and that band and Ron Carter and Tony, record was on. So Miles wanted to capture the first time they saw the music on those records, and that's what happened. Uh, but we were used to that kind of thing as experienced so-called studio cats. I mean, I was telling Ada this story the other night. My great friend, wonderful guitarist Hugh McCracken, who was on a lot of Aretha records. He was the cat for a while. I remember doing a jingle for him, and I came in, and the people were in the booth he was working for, and I put the music paper in front of me, and it was blank. And he pointed around to the fifth stave, no bar lines, no anything. It was, you know, the staves for the students or the bar lines where the music is. And he pointed to around the fifth stave and he said, you play here. That was the direction. It was blank. But I didn't want to say, oh, you know, because the guys that hired him were in the booth. And I kind of knew what he meant. I guess, you know, play about 30 or 50 or 60 seconds in. So I just played. And that would happen a lot in the studios where guys weren't prepared. You just had to kind of fly by the seat of your pants, so to speak, and
Wow.
sometimes try to jam up parts. And sometimes, usually with the right guys there, it would work. Ronnie Cuber was really good. Other guys that weren't experienced doing it, it was a little more difficult.
So
And there
you
were
had you
times.
had a, you had a lot
Sorry.
of you had a lot of studio work also going on.
During this time, yeah, but until like, you know, the mid '80s, it started to tail off.
Hmm.
But during those times, uh, we were. That's why we didn't go out on the road more because we kind of had a. And why I was so insistent on trying to get a slot for my own music, so I just wasn't
Oh.
playing on a lot of other people's records, you know. So that was the conscious thought there, where I wanted to sit home and really find out where my own music was at, so to speak, because we had played on so many other people's records. And
I don't think
but
that I knew that at the extent of your studio work. You know, I heard a lot of other guys, Dave Defani and all these guys in the studio, but I
yeah,
didn't realize that you were a big part of that.
oh yeah, well, all of us in the band, I was a bigger part of it, you know, because I didn't have to double. I did a lot more studio work and jingle kind of work, you know,
Hmm.
for years while that was prevalent. I just played trumpet and flugel. I could play a little piccolo trumpet if they needed it. Mike, I could add this, was really dead set against being a woodwind doubler for some reason. For whatever reason, it's understandable too. So he wasn't that involved in the day-to-day studio scene. He got, if they needed a saxophone solo or if it was just tenor saxophone, even soprano at one point. He didn't want to play soprano. He just wanted
Hmm.
to play tenor. So he wasn't that involved in the daily studio scene. But for years, up until maybe the mid 80s, that's really how I made a living. And a lot of us did by playing on commercials and records, sometimes 10, 12, 15 sessions a week. It was amazing. And what was good about it was always great trumpet players, so you're playing in a section. By then my big band experience came to the fore. I was always good at playing in a trumpet section. If I had to play a little lead, I could do it, but usually the section was, I'll name the first four or five: John Faddis, Soloff, me, Alan Rubin, Marvin Stamm. After the older guys had kind of passed on, Bernie Glow, Thad, Snooky, Ernie Royal. I got some of the tail end of that too, but it was a thrill playing in those sections. The woodwind guys had to be doublers, though. You had to play every woodwind instrument, single reed, double reed, ocarina. The great guys like guys you probably haven't even heard of that did a lot of the studio work. But I was happy to do it, man. I'm not one of those guys that poo-pooed the studio work. I think it helped my trumpet playing and helped my conception. And we're playing with first class writers and first class players.
So
You
I
know,
can't remember what musician for some reason, I can't remember. I had a long
mm.
conversation recently with a great musician who explained to me this Bill Crow. Bill Crow.
Oh yeah,
You
sure.
know Bill Crow. It was Bill Crow.
Yeah,
He explained to me when the changeover from studio to Broadway occurred and the relationship to the music union and why it happened. Because he was
yeah,
first describing to me about the Broadway shows. If you took a Broadway show, you weren't allowed to sub out the show. You had to do the show. And he explained to me at the time, man, a lot of us were getting into doing studio sessions. There was a lot of studio work. It was union work. It was pension, etc.,
yeah,
etc. And you really couldn't make a schedule around it, he explained. And so he said a lot of the top notch guys would not take a Broadway show because they insisted you make all the shows.
yeah,
He said that started the change when the union came up with a contract that gave him a certain amount to take off, and then started the change more, he described, as the studio work started to go this direction,
yeah,
go down, that the top notch cats like yourselves said, well, I got to get me a Broadway show.
yeah. It's exactly right.
you know.
Exactly right. Now, the only thing that separated me from a lot of it, because I saw all that happen, is the fact that at the same time, Mike and I, through the fact that we were jazzers, were also playing and made, with the success of the Brecker brothers, and we had done bunch of records with Hal Galper, jazz records, and we were on a lot of jazz records. We also had uh, performance career under our belt. So that's the what we tried to follow. Mike got career oriented, as did Sanborn eventually. So we didn't join the Broadway contingent, but that's exactly what happened when the studio work started to sink, so to speak. A lot of the session guys found their way over to Broadway and made a living doing that, and they were allowed to take off a little more because the union helped with that respect. But and then studio work really it was like wobbly in the late 80s, and then slowly, especially the jingles lasted longer than the record dates because they were so far behind, but then it just wobbled, and then yeah. And when sampling and all the digital technology came in, it was just over. I remember I got called by a guy I worked for quite a bit, uh, to his home studio, or it was a small studio, wasn't in his house, and he had me play a chromatic scale, 2 octave, and some whole long tones, couple 2 octaves of long tones and some triple tonguing and some of this and that. And I said, well, what is this? What are we doing? And he said, well, I'm doing an experimental film. But what he was really doing was sampling me. I didn't know the word yet. So he had Randy Brecker. That's all he
Wow.
needed me for. And that's what really happened. The digital technology came to the fore, MIDI, and everyone just worked from their basement like I am now. And it
And then
just all stopped.
we started to get lawsuits about the sampling.
Yeah,
Uh,
it all just stopped. So I was very lucky to be there during that time period,
hmm.
and to experience all that. And
How
I,
do you feel? I'm curious. I'm going to jump into the present time.
yeah,
How do you feel about the current state of the relevance of music? When I came up through the 60s and 70s, and I just did a long talk with Greg Errico, the drummer from Sly and the Family
yeah,
Stone.
yeah,
He was one
yeah.
of the producers on like all the last Basie records for the last.
Oh, he
You know,
was. I didn't
it
know
was
that.
Greg
Wow.
Field and him and another organization in
Oh, yeah, I
California.
know Greg. Great.
And I saw Summer of Soul. Did you see that? The big
Yeah,
Harlem.
I did.
I
Yeah,
watched
sure. That
that.
was great.
I was in New York last year and I watched it on
Yeah,
TV. So finally I got a big talk with Greg about it and the whole thing. And he just went on about the record companies, similar to you, about the record companies and the producing and all the work he was doing and how relevant the music was, with lyrics and
yeah.
stuff. How do you feel about the music today, relevance to society? Look, a lot of societies in turmoil, the world has issues, but I hear no music about these things at all. And you could say rap music, I guess, but after a while, it's just, you know,
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I enjoy the rhythm. I saw the halftime show. They made such a big deal out of it, and I enjoyed it. I love the rhythm and the creativity behind it, but I miss the melody and the harmony and just
right.
live real players on the scene. And everything just seems kind of it's hard to describe, just dispersed. There's just no because everything is so machine oriented. All the what are the categories are all just screwed up now. Everything kind of sounds more or less the same because it's all machines in the background. uh, Live performance is not quite at what it was, where you really see a band playing. And that's not to say that there's not fine young composers and some great music out there, but the whole, you use the key word, doesn't seem music as relevant in people's life. And of course, they expect it for free. That's the worst part. And record companies were replaced by the streaming services, who or even worse, really, they pay less than the record companies did. The record companies always made for sure that you would rarely see a royalty.
Mm.
That you had a little slice of their pie, and you would get an advance, and that was it. I don't think I ever received a dime in royalties, but what the streaming services pay are really a shocking absurdity. 0.0043 of a cent. And so that part is really disturbing. And just the fact that people expect music for free is also
It's a
the
horror.
most disturbing.
It's not so much about notes; it's about telling your story from the heart. Would you agree with what
Oh yeah, for sure. And I left this out. Little tidbit too about David. He might have said this to you. I played with Stevie Wonder's band for about 9 or 10 months, somewhere in there, not 72 or 73. Their regular trumpet player sadly just passed away. Steve Medeo had fallen and fractured his skull. I
Mm.
think by emptying out his mini bar, he kind of got over that. But
Wow.
and Dave was the horn section, me, Dave, and a tenor player, Denny Morales. But we were on the road consistently with Stevie, and Dave told me himself that when he's playing, he's thinking of Stevie's harmonica playing.
I didn't
Uh,
know that.
yeah, and I thought, and I'd known him for for a while then, but that was really an interesting, and it's yeah, when you think about it, yeah, that makes sense.
the the solo on James Taylor. What is that song? The sweet song. Do 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 do. I can't remember the name of it now.
Uh,
Anyway, the James Taylor solo where he's playing. Now that you said that, I hear it.
Yeah, yeah. I was amazed at that too. And he was with Stevie for quite a while in a period there, a couple of years. That was a great gig, just being around Stevie that much and seeing how hard he worked on that music. This was during the Superstition era, when his greatest era. He was such a consistent performer. I mean, he never played a bad note, never had gave less than 110%, but his performance was always just every night perfect.
Wow.
And we were amazed, and I was thrilled to be there while I was, and it was great to play with Dave again. But
The
So I
two.
think a lot of that rubbed off on both of us, and watching also how hard he worked. Steve worked on his music 24 hours a day. We would drive
Wow.
to the gigs, and he was in the lead car in the front seat, and I was usually in the second car with Sanborn, and you could see he just had headphones on, working on the stuff, and you could see his head going just 24 hours a day, except when he was on stage, he took off the headphones. So as genius as he was also it was evident how hard he worked to get the music to perfection.
Wow.
So I just wanted that little
I I did
tidbit.
I did not know that you and Dave played in that horn section for a while. Dave never mentioned
Yeah, well, it was just an interim period until Steve Medeo, who was the regular trumpet player, I think, thought up some of those horn lines, was back to the fore. But because we had known each other, we had some good times together during that period. It was several months, uh, uh, maybe not quite a year, but however it looked, it took Medea to get his head back together.
that.
So it
That's
was a thrill.
the
Uh,
song I was thinking of was "How Sweet It Is,"
oh, yeah,
and
yeah.
I watched an analysis, which really annoyed me on YouTube about someone analyzing David Sanborn solo and how he used this scale and this scale,
Yeah, well,
and I said, man, he's just playing like off the melody, man. He's playing off the melody, man. He's not he's.
yeah, well, those
he's
are things you can't analyze. You just got to listen.
if you listen to what Dave's playing, he's playing off of what James Taylor sung.
Yeah,
He might not have. He knew what the chord was, man. It's
yeah,
clear when I'm listening to him, And it's funny how people try to analyze that, That.
yeah, yeah. There's a little overemphasis, and it's great that kids do this. I just saw, and she did very well. Not only transcribing solos, but playing long solos along with, chorus after chorus. How they remembered or they could read music that well. It was what tune was it today? Oh, it was a Hank Mobley solo on one of his. I don't think it was one of his originals, but this young lady had played chorus after chorus and didn't look like she was reading music. She had it all in her head. And there's a couple singers that do that. And that's something
Oh,
I
oh,
never could,
that
you
girl is
know.
amazing, right? Who is that singer that does it with the
Yeah, I can't think of her name, but yeah, I don't know how she does it. She
right?
just remembers everything.
And the pitch is incredible.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
unfortunately, that there seems to be no money in it besides singing on Instagram and YouTube and
yeah.
stuff. You
It's a tough scene, man. Tough scene.
know?
Every once in a while, somebody kind of cracks a little through, but it's. I wish I had more positive thoughts about that. But I always mention I'm 76 now, so luckily I don't have to think too far in the future.
Oh
What
no,
we're in, how I'm going to make a living.
right?
That's the only plus about getting older.
I
But
mean, I appreciate.
no, I was going to say, if I was 18, 19, or 20, though, you have to give careful thought to what you're going to be doing because it's really tough now. You have to have a plan B and really be knowledgeable about social websites and have to want to really do it. That's another thing. Not only being knowledgeable, but that's really time consuming is finding a way to promote yourself that gets you, cutting through. So it's tough. So
It
what were you
really
going to say?
It's really tough, man. I appreciate you taking the time today, but I really enjoyed it. I've never really got to sit and speak with you, and
Yeah,
so
it's true.
some of the
Except
good benefits of COVID, of me speaking with so many cats now, like Bill Crow and you and Bob Mover and Aunt
yeah,
Vincent Herring, and we only got up to what 1980 something. So
yeah.
far. I'm looking in the background, man. How many Grammys is that up there, bro?
Oh, are they showing? Oh, yeah. I usually block them out. My wife set this up. Well, there's seven now. I'm proud to say some of them were worth it. Some of them I don't know how they got there, but I'll take them if they got it.
Hey, man, it's show business, baby.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. Just thank you for everything you've done and will do. And it's great to knowing you all these years and great to see you now. And I hope I'll see you in person one of these days, either
yeah,
here or there or
you know,
everywhere.
I appreciate it, Randy. But,
All right, man. Thank you,
sensei,
Marshall.
arigato
Same to you.
gozaimasu. And
Okay.
if we have time, we'll do another part some other time in the future.
Okay. You got it, man.
Okay, be careful out there.
Yeah, you too. Bye bye.
Okay, bye bye.